How many of you have ever experienced anxiety? No one, right?
That's how we should start a group therapy. There you go.
How many of you have dealt with someone with anxiety? It's all going to be new to you. So what is anxiety? We got to think about that, right? All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the neurobiology of anxiety, talk about anxiety disorders just a bit, and then we'll talk about some drugs that we can use to treat those. I know that's kind of what you're really interested in, but we've got to go through this first part, the neurobiology of anxiety, or it doesn't really matter. I can tell you. I thought that was it as well. Because I looked at you and your hand went over right when the lights went out.
I'm not that magical.
So we're going to talk about neurobiology of anxiety, so you have an idea what's going on. If I just told you, hey, give people an SSRI, but watch out, it might cause some problems, that doesn't really tell you anything, right? You have to know sort of what is the underlying foundations there as to why that could be good or bad or what's going on. So there you go, right? The DSM-5 says a bunch of stuff. I don't think you need to read it all, right? For this class. So we're going to talk about anxiety disorders. They lump obsessive compulsive disorders in there too. So they kind of put that in there. And then they also put trauma-related disorders like PTSD. So they put these three guys in here together. Maybe on some level that makes some sense. I think in terms of treatment approaches it makes some sense. However, I think obsessive compulsive disorder sort of has some other elements to it that make it a bit different than the other two, and we could think about those at some point as well. Because anxiety, I guess there are some motor issues, but we'll think about that. So anyway, you guys know about anxiety. You got panic episodes, phobias, intrusive thoughts, compulsive behaviors, all kinds of negative thinking patterns, right? Things like, why do they put damaging negative thinking patterns? Does it have to be, I don't think there are enhancing, well, I guess there are some enhancing negative thinking patterns. Anyway, the other issue with anxiety is, how many of you have ever seen somebody with just anxiety? They don't make those kind of people, do they? Because they always come in with anxiety plus something else, right? It's often anxiety and depression, or those things go together. It should really just be one thing. It'd be easier, because then those people have to remember two things, and I feel like that can be troubling. But they only have to, I just got one thing, and that's easier. That's my take on it. What happens when you guys are anxious? You guys have all felt anxiety, right? Increased muscle tension, you're going to be restless, sleep disturbances. How many of you have ever been irritable? That happens, right? It's just anxiety. Largely, you're going to be getting your autonomic nervous system beat up, right? So your heart rate's going to go up, you're going to start sweating. You're getting into that fight or flight response, right? And Jason, sometimes fight or flight is appropriate, right? There are certain situations where you need to be geared up to run away or start, flailing your arms around. I don't know if anybody's a Futurama fan. Anybody a Futurama? Nobody's a Futurama. Yeah. One of my favorites is to fend them off with kicks and farts. That's from the episode where they pair off on the work bonding retreat or whatever with the alien shapeshifter. It's a good episode. Zoidberg and Hermes. You guys should watch at least that episode. It's a good one. So sometimes that's appropriate, right? Some of you may have been in a situation where fight or flight might have been an appropriate response, right? You may have been physically assaulted. You may have been in a car accident. Maybe part of your house fell down and you had to lift it off your dog or something. I don't know, I'm just making up things, Carmen. But there are times where having that sort of physical response is appropriate, right? And an anxiety-producing stimulus is going to be, cause that system to come online, right? Unfortunately, the vast majority of the anxiety-producing situations in which you will find yourself and in which your clients will find themselves, although at this point, Jessica, you might actually have some interesting caveats to this, but most of the time, because I know how you Clevelanders are,
It's not Cleveland.
So, you know, in a prison setting, maybe things are a little different, right? And there might be some actual physical things that happen, right? And you have to watch out for those. But for most of us, you know, like what's a big thing that's going to come up like December 12th that might cause you some anxiety?
Exam.
Yeah, the exam for this class, right? Now, is the appropriate response in that class, in that situation, to run away or to like start fighting and kicking?
Yes.
Neither of those, right? I mean, it just doesn't. So most of the things that are going to cause you anxiety, if you think about like the last 10 times you were anxious, probably none of those were times when you needed to run away from something or kick someone, right? They were probably a time when you had a meeting with Dr. Beard about how poor your performance is. Maybe you had a meeting with your supervisor at an internship site, right? Is that what they're called?
Practicum sites.
Practicum sites. I didn't know if you guys did practicums yet. Maybe it was, I didn't know if that's what they were called, because there's like different names for things.
The internship is the big to-do.
That's when you go away. That's the one I like.
That's a trick. Don't talk about it. Don't talk
Too
about
soon, right? It's going to cause anxiety. But again, Corey, you shouldn't like tackle people because of that, right?
it. That might look bad.
That might look bad. If you go into your interview and you're nervous, and then you just like jump up and body slam someone, I don't think you're getting the job unless you were being interviewed by Vince McMahon. I think that's like the one time that works. And apparently also in Montana. But that's a whole separate story, Destiny.
Montana?
Yeah, you can body slam people there and get jobs. That's a true story. You guys don't follow the news? Jason does. He thought that was
So
hilarious.
if I have interviews in Montana,
Yeah, well, that's how that guy won the congressional seat. He body slammed that reporter, and then he ended up winning.
That's where I belong.
That's what?
Nothing?
That's why he won, was because of
No, I said that's where I belong.
where you could buy.
She's angry.
I thought so.
There's
Clevelanders are like that.
She beats us. A lot going on
So
in there.
most of the time, the problem is you want to run and kick people, but you can't. And so then you have, you know, what do you do, right? And so you have to think about why that causes so many people anxiety problems, right? It's not a shock, really, when you think about it in those terms, right, Megan, that so many people deal with anxiety issues because our species didn't evolve as fast as our society did, and so we're poorly matched, quite honestly, for a lot of the situations that we find ourselves in right now, right? We're brilliantly matched for a situation where we've got to like fend off a pack of hyenas, right? Anxiety works well for that. You start hearing, you know, hyenas, fine, you get anxious about that, I don't know, right? And then you can fight them off. That makes sense, right, Jason? But if you hear, you know, Dr. Kennedy coming around the corner with her DSM-5 in tow, because I'm sure that makes a distinct sound.
She actually just like floats.
Mhm.
She floats?
She doesn't even like walk. She just like
There's
floats.
no noise.
She can sneak up on you.
Silent. There you go. That's really, then you just turn around and she's there? That would be
Yes,
really
yes.
exciting.
It's really only terrifying if she's on your portfolio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's rough.
So there you go. There's a mismatch between what our bodies want to do and what society tells us we can do in these situations, right? So we have to figure out ways to cope with that. Now, some folks are better at coping than others, right? You probably all know someone who's really great at coping with stress, and then you probably know someone who's really poor at coping with stress, right? And you see these folks a lot. And I would venture to say, Jessica, a number of the folks that you see are not so great at coping with stress.
Yeah, they have a hard time.
That's why they're in that specific location, right? It's probably what got them there. In many cases, there are many other reasons that people, you know, resort to criminal activity. But often it's poor coping strategies. I think that's a good general sort of statement. So there you go. Now, anxiety is actually very beneficial, right? So I've heard, Kyle, that you have once played tennis.
I've heard of it.
You've heard of it. So last week he had on.
Oh,
Look at his
I
shirt
should
today. None of us got it until he explained it. Yeah,
That's how you know.
Do you know what it is? What
It's
is
Roger Federer.
Thank you. Who is he?
Federer.
The goat?
Oh, the GOAT. Well, he may not be the GOAT. He's
Oh,
just
his name is
No, no, he's
No,
Oh,
it's
don't go
Federer.
down this rabbit
Don't go down this rabbit
Why
hole.
would I get that?
Who the fuck is
Yeah.
that?
We thought his shirt was just misspelled.
No, it's Roger Federer.
Who's better than him?
Now or ever?
Ever.
Serena.
Yeah.
You had nothing to say to that.
Well, I'm not gonna pull a John McEnroe and get in trouble.
Yeah, you just gotta keep your mouth shut. That's a good idea, Kyle. I don't know. I mean, I grew up in the Pete Sampras legacy days.
There's 3 guys that passed Pete Sampras.
3 guys, just 3 though.
Well, he already, you can argue Rod Laver's better than Pete Sampras.
Maybe.
Nadal's passed him, Djokovic's passed him. Well, I had their career Grand Slam.
Maybe you've heard this before.
I learned a lot of tennis.
So, when you're going to have a tennis match, should you go out there extremely relaxed, or should you have a little bit of anxiety to get you keyed up and ready to perform at your optimum level?
It helps if your opponent's a dick.
Okay. I mean, that's
Does that answer your question?
Not really. The point is, anxiety is great to get you mobilized to do
Optimum
things.
level.
Optimum level. Right? You don't want to be too anxious, and then you don't make it out of the locker room.
That's
right?
what I'm
Sure,
saying.
again.
But you don't want to be not anxious enough and not be prepared, right? So one of the great things about anxiety, and I love this one, it encourages more study before an exam, right? That's what anxiety should do. Sometimes anxiety just makes you like curl up and not get out of bed, and that's bad because you've got a problem. And the problem with anxiety is it's really a circular pattern, right? Once it gets started, it's really hard to break that because you've been anxious. So you think about these folks who are agoraphobic, right? And they don't go out of their homes. And so first it was like, well, I don't want to go to this place because maybe something bad will happen. And then, well, I'm not going to go to these 4 places. And then it's like, well, I'm only going to go down this one street. And then it's like, well, you know what? I can get things delivered to my house. So I don't even think I really need to leave my house. And then it's maybe even parts of your house you don't go to, right? Maybe you only go to specific parts of your house. That was really interesting for those of you that read the book. There's a little intro chapter, which is none of you. But it was this woman who had agoraphobia, and she hadn't even looked out her front door in 15 years. And she would only go to her bedroom, the bathroom, and not even her entire kitchen, just the front of the kitchen where there was the stove and the refrigerator, because the back of the kitchen had a window that looked out into her backyard. And that was, that was really problematic for her.
She could just get some volleys.
You have to go outside to buy those. And then you have to pay someone to
Prime.
she doesn't know how to mount them. It's really a problem. She's got to use a power tool. That seems to be a problem. So it's just this really, the only person she would ever see was her daughter, who would come in every week with some groceries.
Reinforcing her.
Or let her starve.
Then she'll have to leave.
Survival of the fittest.
But with the coroner, yes, that's one way to get people out of the house.
Not wrong.
Do you do that, Destiny, when you do, I can just see you in a clinical situation.
This is my favorite thing to work with because you get to be mean.
Really? That's-
You just watch people struggle. Tell them to calm down.
So,
And then space and everything.
there are potential stress, I mean, there's not really much else you can do.
I would see Destiny.
Well, yeah.
You've got your
They put it in the
stressors,
same.
you've got you sort of have responses to that, you've got bodily effects, you guys know what these are, thoughts, you know what those are, but that unfortunately creates some ineffective behavior. Some of these are worse than others. Escape and avoidance, you might not think of those. Indecision, that's not so great either. Aggression, but definitely when you get down to inflexible responses, drug use, those can be some serious problems, right? And so what you see is a lot of folks who have anxiety, they'll try to self-medicate, right? They'll never self-medicate with cocaine. Just as a heads up, it's always, there are other things they can use to self-medicate, typically, things that will kind of calm you down, depress you. Often you see folks resort to alcohol in particular, right? So that's particularly with folks with PTSD. All right, so not a big deal. You guys have stress all the time. You get stressed, whatever, you deal with that. Often they'll give you some drugs. We'll talk more about these later, like benzodiazepines are pretty common. used. They're great for like short-term issues, right? So again, if you're like dealing with divorce, the death of a loved one, some immediate kind of thing that's going to be, you're going to be over that in a short period of time, benzodiazepines are probably not a bad choice. If it's something that's going to be a long-term thing, you don't want to be on a benzodiazepine an extended period of time at all. And too often, I think you guys see people who have been on benzodiazepines for years, and that's bad. It's worse when you see kids who have been on benzodiazepines, right? Which is really troubling, in fact. Anxiety and fear are similar, but they're a bit different. We'll talk about how they're different. They use different brain regions for this, although some of them are sort of similar. One of them is going to be the amygdala. You guys probably know about the amygdala from those days of biobases. So the amygdala is really important for a lot of emotion, process a lot of emotional situations, particularly we're thinking about like fear. I'm not going to get too upset with you about like, do you need to know the lateral or the basal or the central nucleus of the amygdala? Just don't make that face. You don't have to know that. Just know it's the amygdala. And the other thing I do kind of want you to think about, though, is actually there's like an extra thing here. There's like what they call the amygdaloid complex. You don't have to remember that. But there is the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. This is the guy that's actually involved in anxiety, right?
And he's in the amygdala.
He's outside the amygdala. He's like a partner to the amygdala. So they sort of work together. Because you do receive information from the amygdala. These purple places are the amygdala proper, right? These other areas are things that some of these we might think about as the amygdaloid complex, right? Things working with the amygdala. And then some of them are not. I mean, you have the hippocampus is involved. We've got some prefrontal cortex business here. Of course, your hypothalamus has to get involved if we're going to turn on your autonomic nervous system, right? If you're going to have that sort of response, you're going to get your heart rate going, you're going to get blood pressure changes, you're going to get blood flow changes. You're going to have some hormones released. Most of those are going to come from the result of the hypothalamus releasing hormones, the pituitary to release hormones, which tells other parts of your body to release hormones. So it's sort of I know, Jason, it's like a long process with hormones, right? It takes a while. This is why, how many of you love roller coasters? All right, Olivia, what's your favorite roller coaster? The Big Dipper?
Fuck no.
That was a local joke. For those of you who have been to Camden Park,
It's the scariest.
it is most certainly the most frightening roller coaster of all
Is that the
time.
wood one?
Yeah,
Is it scary because you might actually die?
yeah.
Right.
My
You
great,
just scream
it's even more scary because I'm going to tell you, my great grandmother rode that ride.
Oh.
And I will tell you this about my great grandmother and I: our lives never overlapped. Okay, so the best thing is, does that make it like some people may have ridden that with their great grandmothers, right? Didn't happen for me. My great grandmother was long gone before I came around. So why?
Was it surprised?
No, it wasn't the ride. She had a complicated birth and ended up being paralyzed from her waist down. This was like back in the 30s and 40s.
So how'd she have kids?
This was the fifth one. She had 4 before then.
Oh.
But you also, never mind, I'm not even going to go there.
That's fine.
Go there.
You really don't need your legs to have kids.
I thought when you said when you said birth complications, I thought you meant when she was coming out.
No.
And so that's why I was like, how'd that happen?
She was asking about the ride. I was wondering why the ride still exists.
Yeah, I pictured it too. Yeah.
Wait, so how did she
Things about
die?
your great
During childbirth?
No,
Oh.
she lived a long time after that.
Well, so is that unrelated?
No, I think she died from complications of,
Oh.
not being able to like get around. And, yeah, she
Okay.
had some problems.
Was that your grandma's mom?
Yes.
We're trying to stay. Yeah, we're gonna draw a tree.
So anyway, if you ride that roller coaster, whichever one it is, when you get off the roller coaster, so while you're on it, you're going to have some anxiety response, right? I mean, that's a reasonable, I'm not saying a pathological response, but the point of the roller coaster is to have some sort of adrenaline, right? Which is, we'll see in a minute, norepinephrine and so forth play a big role in anxiety. So that's the point. But when you get off that roller coaster, often you'll still feel the effects of it even after the stimulus is gone, right? So even once you get back on the ground, you'll still kind of have that elevated heart rate. You know, some people might shake a little bit, whatever. That's because the hormones haven't washed out yet, right? Hormones take it's a longer action, which can be a problem. If the anxiety disappeared, like as soon as the stimulus disappeared, it wouldn't be a big deal, right? So if you think about, let's say you guys have to go in, you have to talk to Dr. Beard at some point, right? How many of you have done that? Yeah. Yeah, like in a formal meeting, like not just like in passing, but you've had to go in for like a meeting. You've never had to go in there. Okay,
He doesn't meet with us.
that's great. That's the job I want. But Olivia, I know you go in there for supervision, right? And at this point, it may not be a big deal, but your first time going in, that might have been a situation that could have. I'm not saying it did, but could have caused some anxiety.
Like, we thought there was a shooting happening today, so that was a little anxiety producing. This part of me more so than him. But there were some sounds that were happening. So that was,
Here?
yeah, yeah.
When was this?
Like earlier, yeah.
Oh, I was probably still at home.
Yeah, no, like,
He's like, I wasn't here, it was fine.
2:30?
2:30 to 3:30, yeah.
I was here.
I didn't hear that.
I know, I don't know why, but, because I was talking to Cassie, she didn't hear it either, and I had a friend on the street didn't hear it, but it was like, I don't know if they were doing some construction, or
Huh.
what. It was funky. But
Well,
yeah,
that's
so that was a little fireflighty.
So there you go. But afterward, you still had that feeling for a little while, even though you knew things were safe. It just takes some time. It wouldn't be so bad if it was just like, wow, I see a bear, I'm anxious, the bear's gone, I'm not, right? It would just disappear quickly, but it doesn't. It doesn't wash out that fast. All right. Let's see. What else do I think about? Basically, you can stimulate the amygdala and you can cause anxiety. You can destroy your amygdala and you don't really have any fear responses at all. That's pretty obvious, right? You guys kind of know that. Your central nucleus handles a lot of things. When you are anxious, if you think about this, again, your autonomic nervous system turns on. Your reflexes are a little better, right? It's going to be great, Kyle, when you're facing Roger Federer in a tennis match, right? You need great reflexes for that. So you should get keyed up. Increased vigilance, you need to pay attention to things. And then the HPA axis is going to get involved. We're not going to talk a whole lot about the HPA axis, but we'll talk about it some. That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So remember we said the hypothalamus is in your brain. It tells your pituitary gland to release hormones. Your pituitary gland goes to your adrenal gland. That's on top of your kidneys. And you start releasing, that's why we call it adrenaline, right? Like epinephrine and noradrenaline, right? Which is norepinephrine. So those are the same names.
Is there any explanation for like why certain people are like adrenaline junkies versus like not?
We can think about that some. Yeah. So, I mean, we'll talk about some of this later. There are some genetic issues with some folks. There's some incorporation of dopamine in some of these activities, right, that can get you some rewarding benefit from this. There's definitely something rewarding to getting through a situation that caused you some anxiety, but sort of conquering that, right, and coming out successful. So if you start to frame that in sort of like an aggressive encounter sort of thing, and you start to think about the benefits of winning, right? So if you're like, oh, I'm going to jump out of a plane, haha, I beat gravity, you know, and you know, I mean, that's a big deal, right? There's that, but there's actually, I mean, again, there's some positive effect of anxiety, right? Like the front end of that feels pretty good, right? Like when you're getting excited about something, right? It's a hard difference, describe the difference between getting excited about something and becoming anxious about something, right? If I were to ask you, tell me the top 3 characteristics of being excited positively about something and being anxious about something in a negative sense, they're probably going to be the same. You're going to have increased heart rate. You're going to have some sort of, you know, you might not want to call it anxiety, but you might have some sort of anticipation, right? But really, it's a very similar mechanism, and it's quite similar. So Some people will get more of a benefit out of that than others. Some folks will have oversensitized anxiety systems. We'll talk about that and think about risk factors for developing anxiety disorders as an adult. Largely it's, what's one of the number one predictors of whether or not you'll develop an anxiety disorder as an adult is trauma as a child, right? And so those early, what they call them, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, right? And so if you look at folks who end up developing PTSD, you're far more likely to do that if you were abused as a child or if you had some traumatic experience as a child. Obviously, you still need some event as an adult to trigger that, right? But that's going to be different. I like to think about it, again, like hormones. When we're thinking about hormones, there's sort of like two actions with hormones. There's what we call the organizational effect and then what we call the activational effect, right? So if you think about the organizational effect as that early developmental phase, right? And so if you think about like males versus females, for example, and one thing, you don't have to listen to this because you've heard about aggression and the effects of testosterone, but if you think about it in that way, like if you have testosterone present during development, that's going to set up your nervous system in a way that as an adult, if you're exposed to testosterone, you're going to respond more aggressively than someone who wasn't exposed to that. And that's obviously true between males and females, but that's even true between females and females who have either a male twin who was in the uterus with them, or if they have something called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which means that their adrenal glands continually dump out hormones and testosterone, which should not be the case for somebody who has two X chromosomes. So that's the organizational effect, and if you think about ACEs are kind of an organizational effect, right? When you think about things like PTSD, it's going to create an environment neurologically that's going to oversensitize your your HPA axis, your amygdala. There are things that will increase receptors or decrease receptors, and we'll talk about some of that as we go, but make you more or less sensitive to particular things. But then as an adult, you need something to happen. So you spend all that time, developing a male or a female reproductive system, and you're going to be aggressive or not aggressive, Jason, but then at some point you got to hit puberty, right? And so at puberty, you're going to get that rush of testosterone if you've got the Y chromosome, and then that's going to turn things on. Similar to PTSD, you're going to have some event as an adult to activate that. Just because you're predisposed to it's not a guarantee, right? You still have to have those things happen.
Does a pregnant mother's cortisol levels have any sort of organizational effect on her baby?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's yeah, and so that's kind of interesting. Folks whose parents have PTSD are more likely to have PTSD, and that can even be, so like in the animal world, we think about cross-fostering experiments. So even in humans, if there was a cross-fostering situation where they were raised by someone who didn't have PTSD, they would still be more likely to have PTSD. That early environment can affect their serotonin receptor levels, can affect GABA receptor levels, all of these things that can affect their amygdala function and those other brain regions. So yeah, that can definitely. And the interesting thing, we can talk more about this later, actually low cortisol levels are really problematic. So folks who have low cortisol levels, and the reason for that is so you wouldn't think about this, right? You would normally think like somebody who has high cortisol levels, you don't want too high, but you want, a certain level. But if you have high cortisol levels, fine, you can like adjust to stress. But the problem, because there's some benefit to cortisol, right? Like cortisol actually helps you deal with anxiety, right? And that's why we evolved to release that molecule. The folks who have lower, and I've got some charts I can show you later, about 100 slides from now. We'll lose my place. But folks who have low cortisol levels, when they're exposed to stress, they don't have that they're not going to have that same response, right? So they're not going to be able to cope with that. So they're not going to be able to deal with those situations, which is kind of interesting. But definitely that prenatal environment has a massive effect on what's going to happen with that child later on. So there you go. Don't have kids unless you can control your uterus. That's good advice, right? People don't think about these things. makes you wonder, right? Like, how many of you are thinking, well, maybe someday I do want to have kids, but wonder if my cortisol levels are too high or too low, or should you check those things, right? And I'm going to say, Jessica, you should. Not you specifically, but you as...
Yeah, I should.
You, but you as a people, right? And just like everyone, I'm a big proponent of sort of like genetic testing before you have kids, right? Not in sort of a eugenics way, so I want to be clear about that, Destiny. But in the like, you know, what are the odds that my kid's going to have a genetic disorder, right? And do I really want to do that or not? And I think making an informed decision. I don't know if you guys know, are you guys aware of the testing that they give people before they have kids? No, there is none. That's why you're not aware of it. They don't even have to have legs, Jessica. They have kids. So just as a heads up, there's no threshold there. It's just a problem. Legs are not important, but like, you know, I think making sure you're not going to pass on it. And that's why Huntington's disease, we're not talking about Huntington's disease today, but that's why it's such a problem. We could fix that in about 2 generations if everybody would just get genetic testing, and you know if you're a carrier, and if you are, don't have kids, because there's no such thing as a Huntington's carrier. You're going to get it when you're 40. It's going to happen. If you've got 1 copy of the gene, you're getting Huntington's disease. If you get 2 copies, you're getting it when you're younger. That's the story. So,
What's the cost of something like that?
I don't know. You're interested, right? Good. You know people who should be. If more people did it, the cost would go down.
I think 23andMe has like a health section
They
that will
do.
tell you about stuff like that.
And those things are usually like what? $100 or something. Sometimes you can get them on sale for $50.
Not the health one.
Yeah, not the health one.
200.
The health one's a little pricey, yeah. But that's still not bad, right? $200 or your kid has Huntington's disease. I don't know, right? I think the $200 up front's probably worth it.
Cheaper.
I mean, you're gonna pay more in medical costs. Like,
You're not, 'cause
Yeah,
you're
you'll
gonna be
be
dead. Yeah, you're gonna die, but your kid will. So there
Global
you
warming
go.
will kill them anyway.
Huh?
Global warming will kill them anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we've
12
got,
years.
well, 2030 is what they were saying, right?
Yep.
So, I think we're not all gonna die in 2030, but it's just that 2030 we
That's
might.
when you can't fix it.
Yeah, so really, in 12 years, I don't have to recycle. I'm gonna try to recycle now, but in 12 years, Jason, forget it. You wanna hear something hilarious? My father-in-law once, and my wife, I thought was gonna kill him. Because she was like taking recyclables out of their trash can one day while we were visiting to recycle them. And my father-in-law told her, oh, we don't have to recycle because Jesus is coming back. It's a true story.
These people should be genetically tested.
But my wife, somehow,
She seems fine.
she is. I don't, and so people tell me that all the time. They're like, hey, you're smart, you should have kids, don't buy into this. Because my number one caveat is, you've not met my parents. Right? I mean, my parents are fine people. They are.
Also, have you ever seen Idiocracy? Then they'll just be the only smart person with a bunch of dumb people.
What life is that?
It's rough. Here's your amygdala. That's Latin for the word almond. I don't know if that helps you or not. It's supposed to look like an almond. It kind of does. It doesn't taste like an almond, but that's a different story. Here are the sort of outputs, and if you look at that, the amygdala is going everywhere, right? We're sending things to your hypothalamus, sending things all over the place. This will tell you the effects, and then sort of like what emotional response it is. I'm not going to expect you to memorize this. I think it's a nice chart to keep in mind. I think it's really interesting because sometimes we wonder why is it fight or flight, but that also you have to include freezing, right? Because that's kind of the other one. And sometimes that's what you do. That's from the days when we used to ride dinosaurs, and if you stand still, as I learned from Jeff Goldblum, the T-Rex cannot see. That is true. Jeff Goldblum doesn't lie. Not a big deal. Now, there is this place called the locus ceruleus. That means the blue place, just to let you know, and it looks blue. There is a big connection between the amygdala and the locus ceruleus, right? And this is important. Did Ilsen tell you about the locus ceruleus? I'm sure.
Very aggressively, also.
She did, right?
I didn't understand any of it.
No.
Didn't catch a word, but I know I was scared.
Yeah. She's a delightful person.
Yeah.
Explains a lot about you.
Do you know her?
No, I'm just giving shit. And you were talking about her last week after class.
Yeah. No, I mean, she really taught me a lot, but again, that was a class that produced some anxiety
Yes.
in some people. Didn't really me, I just was sitting in the back.
Our class had 5 people. There was
There
no
was
back.
no back.
Did the other 15 drop after the first week?
That's all we had.
Because that's how my class was. When I took that class, like 20 people signed up, and like 8 of us finished.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
She had the effect on people.
Yeah. All right, so we've already talked about the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. We've got that. The BNST also sends the information to places that the amygdala sends to as well. So that's why, again, fear and anxiety, even though they're quite similar, they're kind of different too. Not a big deal. You guys don't have to worry about this. We've talked about the BNST, right? You can definitely screw around with an animal's BNST and get different sort of effects, right? And there are different things that you can do to modulate activity. Anxiety, I'm not going to ask you about this too much, but do know that that is the BNST that's responsible for anxiety, and then the amygdala plays a role as well, but the BNST. A lot of this they do with the elevated plus maze. I don't think you guys need to know too much about that you don't already know. We know about the conditioned emotional response. We talked about that, shocking rats and stuff at some point, right? So keep that in mind. The other thing that I want you to think about too is the role of memory in this process and how the amygdala plays a role in memory. I know we typically think about just the hippocampus being involved, right? But the amygdala is involved as well. So the reason I wanted to mention some of these things to you is when we start talking about the medications that you use to treat anxiety disorders, you're going to know where the targets are, right? And so why would we treat you with something that does this or does that? You know, just to try to think about these things a little bit. You also have your prefrontal cortex. I believe we talked about prefrontal cortex in here, did we? It's for impulse control. Really has a lot of control over the other things. So your prefrontal cortex is always fighting with your amygdala, right? Your amygdala is always yelling, "That's going to kill me." But your prefrontal cortex has to say, "I don't think so," right? So in some folks who don't have prefrontal cortexes that operate properly, like little kids, right? Because your prefrontal cortex doesn't really come online until you're like late adolescence, early adulthood. It's not fully developed, so even up until then you might have some impulse problems, right? And that makes a lot of sense. Like for most of you, if you were to think about your lives when you were 18, and then you were to think about your lives when you were, I don't know, some of you might be 25. What's the average age in here? Probably like 23, 24, 27. You'd have to tell me that. We're looking for an average age. 25 is good? So if you think about your life from 18 to 25, there's some big changes, right? Even though it's only a handful of years, but a lot of that's because of some brain development coming on that hadn't happened yet. What else do we want to think about? Other neurotransmitters. Corticotropin releasing factor. We should think about this guy because it actually comes out of the pituitary gland. Well, it comes out of the thalamus, goes to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? That's a big word. ACTH, which releases your glucocorticoids like cortisol from your adrenal cortex. So this is what helps you deal with stress, right? So when you're in a stressful situation, you'll see those cortisol levels go up a bit. It's because of the CRF to ACTH to cortisol pathway, and that's the hypothalamus to pituitary to adrenal gland. That's that HPA axis.
I have a question with the last slide. So you said that the, no, it was the one before that, I guess. The prefrontal cortex is the one that controls the impulses, and it's always fighting against the amygdala, because the amygdala is like, hey,
Yeah.
scary stuff. So people who have ADHD, are they more likely to have anxiety then? Because they have a problem inhibiting impulses?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't actually know. That's sort of interesting. I mean, it is a possibility. I mean, they would have to have an overactive amygdala, which they may or may not have. I don't know. Does anybody know comorbidity with ADHD and anxiety? That's an interesting question.
I will say that I work with ADHD clinic every week, and I do have a lot of them come in that have anxiety as well. But that's just me, one person.
That's good enough for me. So yeah. I mean, it makes sense on a neurobiological level. There might be some compensatory mechanisms in there that I'm not aware of, but yeah. So your prefrontal cortex is always your impulse control, right? And that's why we give folks who have ADHD a stimulant, right, to kind of activate that prefrontal cortex.
That's making me wonder though, like, if wouldn't stimulants like exacerbate anxiety?
Yes.
Yeah, for the most part, yeah, they do. Which I think is a side effect of the ADHD medications is anxiety, right?
Yeah, so usually the medication for the ADHD takes care of that, and then I come in for the anxiety piece.
Yeah, so there you go. They unfortunately.
Yeah, some of the explanations for that, like relationship, is that the deficits in attention and like executive function create anxiety. So like, for example, some people might worry about missing important information for a test or not being able to study for a test. So like that in and of itself creates anxiety.
It's a possibility too.
Yeah, because I can understand, like, if you're unable to inhibit responses, you're not very receptive to social cues, and then that could cause some social anxiety as well.
If you're even aware of those cues. I mean, you know, then there are those people who are just going to be, not even going to pay attention to any of that. Because they have such a short attention span. I don't know, it's interesting. You know what you should do? If you knew someone who had access to, like, yeah, then you guys should write up a study and take a look at this. Right, Corey? It is a lot of work. That's why I'm asking you guys to do it. I just want to know the results.
But you're working on tenure.
I got plenty of other things going on. Huh?
Mouse fights.
Mouse fights, right, Montana? Mouse fights. That's gonna be big, guys.
You bet on those?
Making
You
rats
bet
fight
on
right
those?
now. That's
Ah.
pretty
Chicken
much-
farm?
That's what you told the first kid.
I'm trying to think about, we could fund our research that way, right?
Mouse fights.
Start taking bets on mouse fights?
Pays for itself.
Yeah. Yeah, chicken fighting is illegal in most places.
Not paid.
Yeah.
What is mouse
No, it's
fighting?
illegal. Didn't stop it.
Yeah, that's what I
Didn't
was
stop
like.
it in Painesville.
Drugs are also illegal.
Didn't stop
I
my.
bet nobody's outlawed mouse fighting though.
I don't think anybody has outlawed mouse fighting.
You could be the guy that makes it a law.
Yeah. No, right?
Jay Brown law.
Good to be- How many faculty members have had a law named after them? That's a guaranteed way to get tenure. Jason, you like this plan, don't you? Yeah, that's what happens. All right, well, those are some interesting questions, surprisingly. There you go. The interesting thing about high cortisol levels is it acts as a negative feedback loop. So once your cortisol levels get jacked up really high, assuming your HPA axis works properly, right? And in some people it doesn't, so, right? But assuming it does, it'll actually sort of inhibit the release of that CRF, and then that kind of, you know, drops down the whole, so the whole system is going to stop releasing once your glucocorticoids get high enough. Which is good, right? Because you want to come back down from that cortisol peak. So if you've dealt with whatever it was causing you anxiety, you've been able to move on, and you're good to go. Again, that's not the case for everybody. CRF actually works in the brain as well. It doesn't just cause the release of ACTH. It can cause other things, particularly helps you like coordinate behavioral strategies, which is important. So if this is one of those things that's like a catch-22, right, with anxiety, because if you're in a situation that's causing you anxiety, you obviously need to develop some sort of plan to get out of there, whatever that is, right? The problem is that once you get really anxious, then you start to sort of have that, that same response, right? And so if you think about the kids that you deal with that are anxious, how do they cope with that anxiety? Whatever it is, they do the same thing all the time, right? It's like, well, that's useless. Why do you keep doing that? That's not helping.
Put the shovel down.
Huh? Put the shovel down. Who digs things? Somebody's a digger?
Lots of people.
Lots of people. My parents never gave me a shovel as a kid. I always had to use screwdrivers and baseball bats to dig holes. That's a true story.
What? Why screwdrivers? They let you have a
Or
screwdriver?
baseball bat.
But not a
That's
shovel?
not a good tool.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna say they let me have it. I'm just saying I had one.
Baseball bat is
I
very
feel like you
blunt.
could be a lot more
You use the
destructive
handle.
with a
You use the
screwdriver.
handle like a hoe, and you can just kind of like hit the ground, and you can see what's in there.
You couldn't have like cut apart a milk jug.
Or just give up.
Diana's got
Why are you doing
projects.
How am I gonna dig dirt with a milk jug?
That's what I did to plant my flowers.
That's loose soil. I'm talking about like hard packed
Oh.
dirt and clay with rocks in
Why were you digging?
for?
it. There's stuff in there.
Very
There's
nervous.
stuff.
I found some chicken bones once. That was kind of weird.
Chicken pie.
Yeah. Just dig up dead turtles. Sometimes they die.
Where did you grow up? Why are there so many
Where-
turtles?
A lot of dead stuff there.
I grew up across the road from a goat farm, so I kind of grew up out a little.
Where? Like in West Virginia?
No.
Where are you
No,
from?
here, I'm from Kentucky. Just
Oh.
kind of half
You
an hour
say,
from here.
no.
No, West
Kentucky.
Yeah, so I mean, we just kind of, just dig things, find rocks.
There's nothing else to do. No judgment from me.
Right, you understand.
Yeah.
I would have probably been digging holes too,
That's what I did.
but I had
You had what?
a cell phone.
Oh, yeah, see, we didn't have cell phones when I was a kid. So we had to dig holes, so there you go. You guys are living in a lap of luxury. Jason, did you dig holes as a kid?
Probably.
Probably. You're not going to admit to that one way or the other. It's going to be non-committal there.
Like in your yard, you were allowed to dig holes?
Yeah.
They didn't get mad, like with the lawnmower?
No, I don't think so. They weren't huge holes. All I had was a bat and a screwdriver. Just like small holes. So, anyway,
Could have done
I could have done meth or math.
Yeah, but he was in North
Meth,
Carolina.
yeah, meth was a far worse option
No.
that.
for like an 8-year-old.
Have you ever had an accent?
No.
Why? Are your parents not from Kentucky?
No, that like my family has been in Eastern Kentucky since the 1700s.
They were the bear.
Why do you sound like this?
As a child, I spoke really fast, and I think they told me slow down. We don't know what you're saying. And I think when I slowed down, instead of getting like a drawl, it just kind of all fell out.
I'm not satisfied with it.
No, but that's-
It fell out.
it just
You just
fell out.
don't have one.
I just talk slow.
Interesting.
I think that's what
I don't
happened.
think that's how accents
I don't think
I
that's
think
how
that's
that
how it's
happens.
supposed
Do you do an accent?
I don't think so.
Bullshit.
I don't try. All right, so we've got your CRF, ACTH, autonomic nervous system. You guys know this. You can actually give animals CRF, so that sounds like fun, Corey. You can squirt it in their brains, and they will actually have anxiety-like responses, right? So CRF itself can get this going. It's kind of interesting. You can actually give them a CRF antagonist, which will reduce some of those behavioral effects. Not a big deal. We should think about norepinephrine, right? So you have these noradrenergic cells, mostly in the dorsal pons. You've really got three kinds of cells. I'm not going to expect you to know that, but it's the third type here that are really sensitive to the CRF. They actually have this kind of tonic activity, so they have like constant, steady firing, right, Carmen? So they're not like little bursts here and there. It's like it's constant, steady firing, and they tend to be the ones that really respond to stressors. What's a great way to stress an animal is restraint stress, right? So if you like put it in a straitjacket, they sell these for mice. No, they don't. Mostly they don't. You just put them in like a cone or a tube. I don't know why that was so upsetting.
I don't like that. You would put a child in this strict.
Yes.
I don't care about that.
You put kids in all kinds of things. You wrap them up.
They deserve to be there.
I mean, you put them in those playpens, you put them in a high chair, you put them in those walkers aren't any good. But even the people who are like the new, like sort of like new wave parents, I don't know, is that what you call it?
They put their kids on leashes.
They wrap them up in that stuff and then they like throw them over their shoulder.
Swaddling? Is that what you're talking
No,
about?
it's
No, where
the
the
carrying
camera
them.
Yeah, whatever those are.
Where you don't.
It's like a baby
You like, you like wear your kid as a shirt.
Really though, they like cover their whole selves up.
Yeah, but even at that, you're still restraining the kid,
It's
right?
weird.
That's fine, I don't care about
Yeah, they did something bad in the past life.
that.
But you just kind of, constrain the mouse for a while. It actually increases activity there in the locus ceruleus. Don't worry about this. That's just some pictures of stuff. I don't think it's too important. And basically, all they did here is really, this is in some animals. They did some optogenetics, right? So what they would see is that if they were to activate the cells, if they increase that tonic firing in that third group of your noradrenergic cells, you would see a reduction in the time that an animal spends in the center of a box. And animals, if they are anxious, will hug the walls, right? So it's kind of like you at a roller rink. I don't know, you guys, do they still have roller rinks? Are those a thing?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know who goes there. Don't tell me. So, like, when you were a kid and you went roller skating, you would like hug the wall, right? Because you were anxious, and then you'd see that cool person, you thought they were cool because you were 10. Out in the middle, like doing all the tricks, you're like, oh wow.
That bitch.
That's what I'd like to do. Rats and mice are the same way. If they're anxious, they'll spend more time up against the wall. If they're not anxious, they'll go toward the middle. So when you start to activate those cells in the locus ceruleus that are dumping out norepinephrine, you see a reduction in the amount of time that they spend out in the open, which really makes a lot of sense for those agoraphobics, right? So if you start to think about like what's the human correlate here, right? And it's agoraphobia. If somebody's anxious, they will stick to the four walls of their home, right? And they'll kind of stay in there. If they're less anxious, they're more likely to go out and to do things in the community.
Makes me think about people from like this area, when they go to anywhere that's flat, they freak out.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're like, it's so flat here, it's too open.
So now I'm wondering about people from Kansas. So I'm wondering what are the rates of anxiety in Kansas versus the rates of anxiety in West Virginia. May not be a good example because we have our own other like problems. But if you were to pick another sort of mountainous state that wasn't dealing with some of the issues we have, I wonder if you would see lower rates or higher rates in them. It's interesting, right?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're used to, right?
I don't know. I don't know. I'd like to find out. You want to do that study?
Shove people into open spaces.
See what happens.
See, that's the opposite of what you were trying to get mad at me about. I'm not going to find them. I'm going to let them go out into a nice big park.
That sounds fun.
Yeah, I guess. Actually, the most, so this, I guess I could tell you this is actually an interesting sort of, as a species, the most pleasing sort of view is actually a relatively flat sort of area with some trees off in the distance, right, as a species. And the reason for that is that really closely mimics the sort of the landscape in Africa where our species evolved, right? And so if you were to worldwide ask people, like show them images, like of what kind of view they would like out their window, that's typically what they'll pick. It's interesting, right? Think about that. What about other rats? Male rats, history of stress. You can actually, if you give them low doses of CRF, they'll actually get sensitized to that, right? Which is really sort of an interesting parallel to PTSD, right? So you think about those folks are sort of sensitized to anxiety, right? It's kind of interesting. You guys deal with a lot of, how many of you are at the VA? You deal with PTSD folks?
No.
I do.
You do?
They're in general. I got so control.
That's exciting. You know what you should do? Well, we'll talk about it in a minute. Hang in there, because I'm going to tell you what you should do to fix these people.
Okay, I look forward to hearing that.
It's going to be great. So we've got norepinephrine, not a big deal. We talked about this. There are actually some antagonists for the autoreceptors, right? For norepinephrine that will cause you to kind of have fear responses and have some anxiety. So there's that. Sounds exciting, right? Let's see. Epinephrine, what else do you guys need to know? It's already 5 o'clock, how'd it get so late? Oh, so speaking of veterans with PTSD actually have higher norepinephrine levels typically circulating in their blood vessels than folks without PTSD. So I kind of give you that idea that norepinephrine is involved. I don't think we always think about norepinephrine as much. When you think about this, you've got your beta-adrenergic antagonists, right? That actually blocks the formation of emotional memories, which is kind of interesting. So if you give folks these beta-adrenergic blockers or antagonists, what they'll do is you can give it to them right after trauma. So there you go, Sierra, right? And actually, it'll prevent their development of traumatic memories. The other thing you can do is you can actually have them play Tetris. Did we talk about that in this class?
Not this class.
Not this class. It's a cool story though, right? I think it is. I mean, anytime you can have somebody play Tetris and it prevents them from getting PTSD, I mean, it doesn't help them once they already have it. So maybe give it to them before. So Destiny, they did this study where they made people watch video clips of people getting their arms cut off, like real, like surgical amputations, real car accidents where people died, like serious. This was approved by the IRB. I didn't come up with this. Not sticking a mouse in a cone. So you watch these videos and then you sort of write down immediately afterward, or sometime afterward, and over the next 6 weeks, like how many times you had that, like intrusive sort of flashback of that, right, so to speak. What was interesting is they had a group of folks who just like watched that video and like, okay, write stuff down. You had another group that was like, hey, watch this video, and then a few minutes later they're like, hey, check out this cool Tetris game I've got. Play Tetris for 10 minutes or something. And they would play Tetris for about 10 minutes. And what they found is that the folks who played Tetris actually had a significant reduction in the number of those intrusive flashbacks that they experienced in those video clips. And so sort of the idea behind why that happens is because Tetris is competing with that visual spatial memory, and you're not able to encode the memory of that video clip as well. And so you have that other task going on. It's kind of interesting, actually. Kind of cool. They got a pretty good publication out of
Oh,
it.
but like you can't just whip out Tetris after you've been raped. So like I don't know if we could actually ever use that.
Well, they waited 30 minutes.
Like take this. Should we just all carry those things?
That's
or
possible.
Tetris?
But you all have Tetris.
We do
Right,
have
Megan?
Tetris.
Because you all have what?
Phone.
Cell phones.
I got it right.
So
You
you just
did.
need to spread the word.
So if we're
If you're ever raped, play Tetris.
Yeah.
Within
You
30
can't
minutes?
testify.
Within 30
You
minutes.
don't have.
That might not, yeah.
Unless you want to press charges.
Yeah.
We can make this a thing.
Well, you guys can work on it. But they were thinking, they did within 30 minutes because the average wait in the United States at an emergency room is 30 minutes.
Oh my god.
I know, right? Isn't that bad? That's the average wait.
I thought that was pretty good.
Now,
I
that's
know,
not-
I feel like that's like
pretty
damn,
good.
30 minutes,
Yeah,
I'd be
yeah.
happy with that.
Yeah.
I don't go to the emergency room that often.
I don't think people do as much because it keeps you.
Don't either, but if I had to go, I'd rather sit there 30 minutes than 5 hours. Yeah.
Yeah. There you go.
Hmm.
Again, there are drugs. Here's a drug that can be used to treat folks after auto accidents, right? Part of the idea is that if you were to you guys know about memory consolidation, right, from those BioBasics days. So if you were to pull out a memory from sort of long-term storage, it's susceptible to manipulation, right? For instance, this is how you can create sort of false memories. It does happen, right? Yeah, I met her once.
Did you?
Yeah, I did. She was nice.
Mayor Connor said he heckled her.
He heckled her. That sounds like something.
He said because she was a woman.
That's what he said?
What the hell? Why?
No comments. I'm gonna take the Kyle line on that. Let's not say anything.
Don't pull it back to
Did you
the-
really? Why?
There you go. So once the memory is out and you're sort of like dealing with that memory, you can actually change it a little bit, and then when you put it back, it's not the same way it was when you brought it out. So, I guess if you were to bring that thing out and then start screwing around with some of your like storage mechanisms, try to put that back, then that would be bad, right? So there you go. A lot of the things that you take to treat anxiety affect the locus coeruleus, right? So benzodiazepines, for example, largely all of these really, anything that you're going to take that's going to treat anxiety is going to work on GABA, right? It's going to increase GABA function. But particularly it's going to increase GABA function in the locus coeruleus, right? There you go, you guys can take a look at this, not a big deal. So again, tricyclic antidepressants, don't take those if you can help it. The side effects are pretty nasty. They'll treat your depression, but you'll like grow an extra arm out of the top of your head or something. The side effects are pretty nasty. MAOIs are the same way. They're also really sort of nasty side effects, right? So there you go. But they actually work because they actually increase norepinephrine function, which you would think like, well, that's not what we want to do. But when you do that, you can actually shut down the locus coeruleus, right? It's not norepinephrine activity everywhere that we're concerned about. It's really just kind of in that one place.
I think usually prescribe Zoloft for anxiety.
They will, yeah. Yeah, Zoloft is pretty common. They'll use SSRIs a lot.
Why does that work?
Serotonin plays a role, and serotonin can actually, through this process, modulate the activity of the locus coeruleus. So it all sort of comes back to that same idea. Not too big of a deal. All right, GABA. The more we increase GABA, the more this stuff shuts down. Shut down your amygdala and your other places, not a big deal. GABA opens chloride channels, you guys know this. Benzodiazepine receptors, there's actually on the GABA receptor, there's a benzodiazepine receptor, right? So there's a site on the GABA receptor itself where benzodiazepines will bind, and they can activate that or help modulate it. They can't activate it on their own, which is kind of interesting. So if we take a look at...
Is there some kind of naturally occurring benzodiazepine?
Yeah, so, I mean, yeah.
I mean, there's a receptor there.
There is a receptor there, right? So you have, chemicals inside your body. I mean, they are similarly structured to GABA as well. But yeah, you'll have substances that you'll release You have some neurosteroids that you can release that will help mediate anxiety. You've got some other neuromodulators as well that you create and release that work on these receptors. We call it the benzodiazepine site because somebody pharmacologically tested it and benzodiazepines work on it. Same reason that we have nicotinic receptors when we think about acetylcholine. You don't make nicotine inside your body, but nicotine is an agonist for that receptor. So that's just how it got that name. Let's see. Just other things that work. Interestingly, I'm looking for this chart. Folks with panic disorders don't seem to have as much benzodiazepine binding, especially in those frontal lobes. Idea there. Possibly because they have fewer of these GABA binding sites. You're not going to have sort of the same response that somebody else would, right? To the normal chemicals in your brain. Just really looking for this. Where is that? I had this nice chart. I guess it's way down here, and I didn't really want to go that far yet. We'll keep whatever annotations. All right, so anyway, we talked about that, benzodiazepines. You guys have a handle on that. Not a big deal. Basically, they help open GABA channels. They won't open GABA channels on their own. So now you might think, well, why don't we give somebody GABA with benzodiazepine? We have GABA anyways, right? So we don't really need to give you GABA with that. But if you were to only have benzodiazepines present, they in and of themselves will not open those chloride channels. You have to have GABA present as well, and that actually creates a stronger sort of opening, right? And so they'll be more likely to open the channels and open more channels than with the GABA by itself. So that's why it's a modulator, that's why it's a neuromodulator, not a neuroreceptor, right? So if it was a neurotransmitter, GABA is a neurotransmitter because it can actually open those channels in and of itself, right? Benzodiazepines are not able to open those channels in and of themselves. They can just help. If GABA is there, the benzodiazepine can help and facilitate that opening. Does that make sense?
So what are the long-term effects of benzodiazepines? Like, I have a client, he's done them for 14 years and came off of them in February.
Oh,
Yeah, so what kind of...
14 years on benzodiazepines, right?
Bad. Yeah, for real.
All right, so you always have to wonder, like, are any of these good, right? What are these websites? Let's see. Click on things, but nothing happens. Oh, that was- So when you're thinking about like side effects for benzodiazepines, obviously some of the really bad things that you can have. So because you have to think about this is this is causing a reduction, right? It's an inhibitory mechanism. So like the end result is like calming down, right? So that's pretty bad. Before you get there, you can have a lot of problems. Obviously, reducing a lot of cardiovascular issues, right? Because again, if your autonomic nervous system is keeping your heart rate going, then benzodiazepines are going to slow that heart rate down. It's going to drop your blood pressure, right? And that's not including some of these more like allergic kind of reactions, right? You've got some sleeping issues, breathing issues. There are problems with tolerance to this, right? So if you think about what would the withdrawal from benzodiazepines be? If it's causing you to have low blood pressure and your heart rate's down, and then you stop taking it, you know, what's going to happen? Your heart's going to go crazy. You can have some real problems there. It's really bad in old folks, right, to give them benzodiazepines. I don't know how old this individual is.
57.
57, yeah. So you're getting to the point where you got to start worrying about that. They don't metabolize drugs as fast, right? Older people don't. On top of that, these problems, right? Because there are these like cognitive problems as well, right? If you're on a benzodiazepine, you're not clearly thinking about things, right? Because again, everything is inhibited, right? You're kind of just shutting down a lot of stuff. In older people, that can actually start to look like dementia. It can start to look like other problems, right? If you have any problems where you feel drowsy, right? You're dealing with someone who's already prone to falls and hip breaks and so forth, right? That really just kind of amplifies that problem as well. So that he's already stopped in February.
Yeah.
Yeah, how do you do with the withdrawal?
He has panic attacks now. And
Sure. I mean,
Yep.
yeah, there's that. Yeah, have they tried a different I'm just curious, right? Have they tried a different medication? Other than benzo, because there are other things that, you know, that you can take to treat anxiety.
I'm not exactly sure.
Okay, I was just curious. I mean, don't mean to put you on the spot. I just didn't know if they had tried like an SSRI. They may not be effective. SSRIs don't work with everybody. There are some folks who have some weird genetic anomalies where SSRIs are sort of useless.
Shouldn't that be tried out first?
You would think.
I would have thought so.
He's actually an assessment patient. He came in wanting to know why he's having concentration and memory difficulties. Well,
There you go.
Did you tell him 14 years of a benzodiazepine? That's your answer?
And if his heart rate is increased coming off of it too, I would think like that could trigger a panic attack.
Of course.
I think like from having a panic attack.
How many of you have ever accidentally ingested too many energy drinks and you thought you were having a panic attack? Coffee, right? And you're like, what am I so nervous about? And you're like, oh, I just had a gallon of Starbucks coffee. That's what I'm so nervous about, right? And so you can do it to yourself. Try to give yourself a panic attack. Think about that exam on December 12th. Yes, I'm just trying to
Still
induce.
don't even know what that is.
See how great you guys are at coping with stress.
Probably decided against that.
Yeah, so I would have hoped that they would have tried something else first, Jason. That may not have worked. That might have been why they went with the benzodiazepine. I mean, I guess there are far worse things than using a benzodiazepine, right? I mean, I think, you know, if he was trying to self-medicate with alcohol, maybe a benzodiazepine might be a better choice. I don't know. That would be a tough call, to be honest with you.
Doesn't a benzodiazepine mess with your liver too then?
Yeah, it does. See, Kristen, this thing's laughing at me. But seriously, there are serious side effects from being on a benzodiazepine for a long period of time. There are serious side effects from drinking a lot of alcohol, right? And so I think you have to decide which is worse.
That's why I'm laughing, because it's sad that the medication prescribed is often about the same as alcohol.
It is sad, right? Benzodiazepines are really great if you're having a freak out right now. I don't know what the DSM-5 term for a freak out is. That's it. It's a freak out, right?
Yeah.
If you're having a freak out, you got to put somebody down for a bit. Benzodiazepine is going to do it. It is, right?
What are some examples of common benzos?
Of what?
Of common benzos?
Xanax.
Yeah.
Valium, Quantum.
I wonder if it's in there.
Let's see. Yeah, those are all, there you go. There's a whole list. Common benzodiazepines available in the U.S. Does that help, Cassie?
That does help.
That's exactly what you wanted, right?
Yes.
And then it gives you the sort of
That's K in the
name you know, brand name here, and then the other name. So, and a lot of these are used to treat other things. That's the problem with benzodiazepines, right? They'll use them for actually they're used a lot for alcohol withdrawal because they have anticonvulsant properties, right? So, huh?
For opiates.
Yeah,
You should prescribe that anymore.
you can use a lot of that. Valium is actually sort of the reason, sort of was one of the drugs that started the sort of like people abusing benzodiazepines, right? Because Valium was so readily available. Prior to Valium, it really wasn't, you know, as readily used, as abused as much. Partly because the half-life on a lot of these guys is so short, right? You just like, you take it, you fall over asleep, and then you're back up 5 minutes later. And you're like, oh, well, what did I get out of that? And not much. But as they start having the longer half-lives, then they'll.
They used to prescribe Valium for like everything, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
oh, well, you've got nerves, here's the Valium.
well, you know, and it amazingly calmed a lot of people down.
It's amazing.
I know, right? It was really amazing how that worked, how increasing, like, the amount of GABA you have available in your brain really just sort of caused people to melt.
All my clients that have been on benzos for like 10 plus years, they have like motor tics with their mouth. They like stick their tongue out like involuntarily or like smack their lips over and over for long periods of time.
Yeah.
I thought that was real interesting pattern.
Do they do weird stuff with their eyes, like blinking slowly?
Things to watch for. Jason, did your client do that?
No, I didn't think so. I didn't notice it.
We're really putting you on the spot now, right? Sorry about that. I was just interested.
No, there was something, some release, something in the water at one of the training sites in the 80s that was released by the VA. Most people were getting cancer from it, but apparently he served this site and was wondering if the chemicals in the water were resulting in his memory and concentration loss. I'm like, there's no way to tell.
And that helped his anxiety, I'm certain. Yeah, there's no way to tell.
There's no help for it, so don't
Not
drink
with
the
that
water at
history,
the
no.
VA.
It's good for you to
Wait,
know
what's
now.
up with the water at the VA? That's what he said. He said they were putting stuff in the water.
It was
Are
at
you
one
trying
of
to
the,
turn the frogs gay?
This is why they test.
I'm trying to remember the name of the site.
Post.
I don't remember. It was known as it was a place where they did boot camp, but I don't know the name of the site.
Yeah, there you go. Agent Orange all over again. Gulf War sickness.
We did not sign in.
We talked about that in this class. All right. Well, we need to start moving faster. You guys are asking too many questions. We've got 50 minutes to get through 114 slides.
That's not painful.
This is about some steroids, some neurosteroids. There are neurosteroids that you make that you can, that actually seem to help when you administer those. So that's kind of interesting. Serotonin, we've already sort of talked about serotonin. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time talking about that. Just sort of have the serotonin story. Don't worry about those. Again, serotonins typically are first when you want to treat anxiety. Now, what's interesting about this is this is a great one, right? So first, you're going to give somebody an SSRI, and you're going to say, "Hey, man, it's going to take you like 4 weeks before this starts working," right? Because there's some lag from the time you start taking an SSRI until you see relief. On top of that, you're going to have to tell them, you know what? You might actually start having a little bit more anxiety right at the beginning, which is sort of, it's like, oh, geez, how do you deal with that, right? So there you go. So there is a slight increase in anxiety very early, you know, in that treatment. So tell them to hang in there. Just why it happens. I mean, it happens sometimes with folks. Again, Montana, you were asking about like developmental effects earlier. You actually need serotonin for proper neural development. So if you're screwing around with your mother's serotonin levels and they're not at the appropriate level, then that can cause some problems during development as well, right? So if her serotonin levels are too low or too high, that can be problematic. There are also folks that have problems with their serotonin transporter. We talked about SERT at some point, right? Which is interesting. There are folks who have this gene that doesn't work properly, right? And so what they'll end up with is like a higher serotonin level prenatally than what you should have, and then later they have sort of higher emotional responses, which is kind of interesting, because their nervous system is going to develop in the presence of that elevated neurotransmitter, and so that's going to change the dynamic on your receptors and connections and so forth. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting because we have so many. I wonder about this sometimes, right? We have like so many people right now on SSRIs, and so many of them are women, and so many of those women are having kids, right? You start to think about the next generation of kids coming out, right, Corey? I mean, are they going to have emotional? Are they going to, do you know what I mean? I mean, it's really sort of a fascinating thing. I like to think about things in those sort of generational effects. You guys read that movie, or not read that movie? Read that book? They made a movie out of it. It was like a documentary series called Freakonomics. Anybody read Freakonomics? You watched it?
Yeah.
I didn't watch it. I read the book. I'm old school.
Well, aren't you?
Because I dig holes with a screwdriver. So I read the book. But did they talk about the like the Roe v. Wade and the reduction in crime in New York connection?
I don't remember. I sure remember them talking about people's names.
Oh yeah, that was an interesting one. You didn't think that was
She's got a
interesting?
bad name.
They use the name Destiny. Technically related to a stripper, and how you're like going to become a stripper. Watch,
You're a success
watch
story.
shooting class. It's nice.
You bucked the trend. There you go. That's I've forgotten about
You
that.
are resilient.
Think about all those other support structures you had to go into a different line of work. So
I don't remember, I'm sorry.
but there was an interesting sort of story in there about the reduction. There was like a drop-off in crime in New York City a number of years ago, and so people were like, "Oh man, that's definitely." Rudy Giuliani took a lot of credit for that, right? And he was like, "Oh, that's me because I did all of these like great things that were unconstitutional." Like the stop and frisk stuff, right? Like, hey man, your eyes are crossed. I'm gonna see if you're carrying a gun and some coke, even though you're just like going in to buy bagels. Whatever. But in fact, what was really going on was like, a generation before that, somebody said, hey, you know what? Women should be in charge of their uterus. And if there's something in there they don't want, they ought to be allowed to get that out of there. I know.
Nice way to put that.
But it's such it's at the bottom level though. That is like the most, in my mind, that's like the simplest way to put it, right?
Get it out.
I mean, clearly, if you have something in your body and you don't want it there, I think you should be able to get that out of your body. Like that seems to me like I've got a kidney and if I don't want that anymore, and if I want to pay the money to get that removed, I should be able to do that. I don't think anybody should tell me like, man, you got to hang on to that extra kidney. It's like I don't want it. It's weighing me down.
They'll let you do that though.
They should. It's my kidney. My insurance may not pay for it. Just tell my doctor I've got extreme kidney pain to take it out. Anyway, the point is, so Roe v. Wade, they said, hey, abortions, those are legal. And then, surprisingly, about a generation later, you saw a reduction in crime, right? Because people who were going to have a baby that they weren't going to take care of, which you all know, like the predictors, right, for crime and so forth, right? We're like, hey, I've got another option here. I'll just do that instead. And guess what? Those kids were not born who might have been born into bad situations where they, obviously weren't planned or weren't the desired outcome there. And then you see a reduction in crime, right? So it's kind of interesting. So I think about those generational effects, right? Like, and then I don't know. Should I tell you guys about crocodile penises?
Yes.
You guys are all excited about that, right? So there's this, and it's actually alligators, I think, because it's in Florida. There's this group that's like measuring alligator, I don't know why you would measure alligator penises. Like, I don't know how you start this, right? Like,
Penile?
is it penile?
I don't
No, I think it's penises.
You know,
Because it's walruses.
All right.
Right, it's all whether or not it's a Greek root.
I think it all should be ended in Latin.
Let's just keep it the way it is.
Penile.
What are they doing to the penis?
with the penile.
So they measure the length of the alligator penis, right? And I don't know if you know how to measure the length of an alligator penis, and I don't specifically know how.
What's the average length
That's
of
important.
the alligator penis?
You know, I don't know. Olivia, why would that? It's like, that's not the point of the
Do
story.
they get hard? They're hard.
What?
Google alligator penises.
I think I'll let you do that on your device.
Are they already hard? Are they hard? Just the alligators
No,
hard?
they're not. So listen, I'm gonna tell you about, so like birds, reptiles have one hole called a cloaca, right? And everything comes in or out of that hole. And so you have to reach into that hole to even know if the alligator has a
It's
penis.
permanently erect.
Yeah, it says they're always erect.
So you're right, Leon.
So the point of the story though is,
Oh, there it is.
so people have been measuring alligator penises for some time now. I know, and what they've seen is actually the alligator penis is getting smaller. And simultaneously, they're noticing an increase in estrogens in the sewer, like the water that's dumping in to the oceans and the rivers and streams.
Because more people are on birth control?
That's a possibility.
Or is it the soy?
That one too. And then there's like also issues with like BPA stuff sometimes that that's an issue as well. So there you go. So again, I think about these generational effects, right?
BPA, like the stuff that's in plastic water bottles?
Yeah, that's why it's like BPA free is a big deal. There you go.
So is that making the female alligators more, I don't know, aggressive?
I don't know, I mean, it would, so it's sort of like, you know, if you were to start to give a guy a bunch of testosterone, he's probably not gonna get more aggressive, he's probably already capped out somewhere, right? So if you're giving females more estrogen, they're not gonna get more.
Emotional.
I'm sorry,
I can say it, you can't.
what does that look like in an alligator?
What does it look like in an alligator? That I don't know.
Very irritable.
Crocodile tears.
They cry more.
I don't know.
Crocodile tears.
That's interesting though, right? Alligators are fairly docile anyway,
Really?
compared to crocodiles.
Ew.
Crocodiles are more aggressive. So that's why you don't see people wrestling crocodiles, they'll wrestle alligators
Oh,
because they're more docile.
it's an unfair fight.
It is. What's the difference?
Yeah, like.
Some big differences actually. A lot of it's with like head shape and size. Alligators have a wider head, right? Crocodiles have a more narrower head. There's some other things. Not typically.
Crocky.
Oh, yeah.
Crocky.
So there you go.
Wait, side note, you said about the SSRIs and being pregnant and shit. I've had several patients who, like, they have a baby and they told me they quit taking their SSRI cold turkey whenever they found out they were pregnant. So that's a thing a lot of women are doing without consulting their doctors. They're
Yeah,
just
I
like,
would recommend them talking to the doctors about
Yeah.
that first. The other thing I typically recommend is if you're going to get pregnant, think about that like 2 years ahead of time, right? And not just go like, oh man, my pants are getting tight. Why is that? I must be pregnant. Been buying less tampons lately. You know, it's like, think about it ahead of
They're
time,
not
right?
If only they all did that.
I know, right? If people actually plan ahead for kids. I'm starting to think like how much smaller my classes would be.
That was fun.
No, but everybody's like,
Wasn't a fair baby. Wait, you weren't.
She was destiny.
Were you a condom baby? Is that what you said?
I was an affair baby.
So you were definitely down it.
you didn't have to share that.
Well, it was quieter at first. Then Olivia asked me, so Mark. It was really just to one person at first.
All right,
Now
well.
we know.
Dopamine obviously plays a role in reducing or in modulating activity. Anxiety, not a big deal. Let's see, we've still talked about some of that GABA activity, which is interesting. Not a big deal. I do want to move on. Let's see, because we're all kinds of different genes. You guys probably aren't going to deal with folks who've had effects. HPA axis stuff, though, in those early stress events, that causes a big change. Can cause changes in your HPA activity, HPA axis activity, cause changes in sensitivity to other sort of situations. This is actually kind of interesting. This is, we're looking at the amygdala here. You can look at some of this one's not that interesting, but if you look at like density of cells in the, compared to like an early prenatal stress situation and a control, things change. Here's the hippocampus. Look how much the hippocampus is much healthier in a control versus the early prenatal stress. There are far fewer cells that are going to be present there, which is a problem if you guys want to have like, functioning learning and memory kind of things, right? And this is true, like glucocorticoids will kill your brain cells. So if you're stressed all the time, they'll come back around and start killing off your hippocampus cells. So if you were really, Olivia, stressed because you didn't know something for an exam, and then guess what happens? You're really not going to know anything for an exam because the more stressed and anxious you get about it, the more glucocorticoids floating around, the more cell death you're going to experience. So that's why another reason it's like such a loop, right? And these are just different parts of the hippocampus, not a big deal. Again, talking about hippocampus issues. Here are some other cells. This is destiny from chronic immobilization. We put the mouse in the cone, so we're going to hold it there for a while. This is like the hippocampus, and then later we'll see the basolateral amygdala. But you can see control has bigger dendrites, larger branching, better looking cells. I mean, these guys are pretty pitiful, right? This is chronic immobilization stress.
How long do you hold them that way? That says 10 days. Is that typical?
Yeah.
Longer usually?
No, that's a pretty typical time frame, is 10 days. You're not going to do it for, weeks. I guess like a week and a half.
When you do this kind of stuff to mice, rats, whatever you do it to, can you use them again later for something else? No. So you just kind of go through them like test tubes, like very quickly.
Well, if I want to take a look at their brain cells, I have to get their brains out.
Solid point.
So that's kind of like a one and done.
Yeah.
Picture something worse than immobilizing.
I guess if you were like doing behavioral tests, could you?
Possibly with behavioral tests, you can use it if you were again not looking at any kind of brain structures.
But couldn't that also like affect your studies since they've already learned something
It's
in the
possible.
past?
Typically with rats, you don't worry about that for a couple of reasons. One, they're relatively inexpensive, and two, I say relatively because like 6 rats might cost you $800 to get them shipped to you or something, right? Yeah, you guys don't know this stuff, right? It's expensive.
Because they have to be pure.
They do, and then they come in and they're going to be genetically the same. They're going to have the same diet. You're going to know everything about them, right? So you can tightly control the experiment. So with like rats, and they readily breed, right? You can get every time a mother has pups, they're 6 to 12, right? I mean, kind of depends on the strain. When you move into other studies, obviously with humans, we let humans do more than one study. Because that's how some of you passed intro to psych. Why are some of you looking at me? But also with monkeys, typically, if you were using a primate, you would use that for more than one study. You would use that over some extended period of time, over a number of years, so maybe 3 to 5 years is a standard time to use a monkey. And you would use different behavioral tests there, and you could measure brain activity or something. With rodents, we don't typically you are always trying to reduce and reuse and replace, that's just good animal study design. But sometimes, if you really want to look at the effects of chronic immobilization stress on dendritic length here, there's really only one way to do that. You've got to hold them still for 10 days, and then you've got to pull their brains out and see if things are different. Here's your amygdala, which is actually sort of interesting. That it's kind of the reverse effect from the hippocampus to the amygdala, right? So the amygdala, they have more branches. So they're going to be collecting more information and more likely to get activated because they're getting more inputs, right? And so you're going to have that sort of exaggerated stress response. So that's kind of interesting, right? So this immobilization stress doesn't reduce dendritic length. It does in one place, but somewhere else it increases it. So that's kind of cool, right? So go back in time if you think you're anxious now, Carmen. Go back in time and tell your parents to chill out. Doesn't work that way, does it? As soon as I invent that time machine, just watch out. I'm gonna go back in time and just get a Marty McFly hat.
Could take yourself a shovel.
Could take myself. Not a big deal. Obviously, if you've got some problems with your hippocampus, you're going to have trouble with learning some things. Not a big deal. Let's see. We already talked about the prefrontal cortex not being active until you're an adult. Oh, prenatal stress does have, we should talk about this, like gender effects, right? Which is kind of interesting. Most of us, when you think about like PTSD, for example, what's the stereotypical person that jumps into your head?
Military person.
Yeah, which is typically a military man. Yeah, right. But in fact, females seem to be a bit more sensitive to the development of PTSD than males are. I don't know if anybody finds that interesting.
I wonder if that's because typically females are smaller and weaker. Well, they're not weaker, but
We're susceptible to more traumatic events.
That's
Yeah, I was
right.
gonna say, we're already hypervigilant.
We get raped a lot.
Quit reading.
Yeah, I mean, honestly,
Especially
I was
with
thinking
Whitney
like,
and Trump.
You're thinking like cave women.
yeah, I was thinking back that far.
Yeah.
So,
Wow, that was.
They were raped a lot too. Yeah, mostly. All of them
you've
raped
really always been raped?
all the time.
Yeah.
That's what the web
Happens
box
every
was
day.
about.
Cave women?
Yeah.
I didn't read the one.
Date rape drugs.
Oh, they raped us.
All
Yeah.
the rape.
Yeah.
Although men are actually,
Yeah.
they are traumatized more, actually. But yes. What? My dissertation's on PTSD. You guys are traumatized more because you go into riskier jobs. So, we are the weaker sex, if that makes you happy. We're traumatized less, but we have more PTSD.
Right.
But we are raped more. So stop it.
Yeah, there's that too.
Did you say stop?
Well, who you think watches these videos?
Like that, this is gonna make a difference.
It's like some of the people in this class. And like if I'm really like thinking about, that's a wasted message. Like I've not even bothered to tell you guys yet to go vote on Tuesday. 'Cause I hope I don't have to.
Mama Lynn's cut.
She did. I got after my other class to vote, but I hope most of you guys vote. How many of you already voted? Anybody early vote? I don't like early voting either. I like to go in on election day and get my sticker.
There you go. They have early
Post it on
voting
your
stickers.
phone.
They have what?
Sell early voting stickers.
Really?
It says I voted early.
Oh,
Oh.
but I'll lose that by the time Tuesday gets here.
He's gotta take a Snapchat photo. Mm-hmm.
I have to get a Snapchat account first. All right. When estrogen levels are elevated, Cassie, sensitivity to stress is greater. That's important. You guys know about generalized anxiety disorder. I don't need to talk about that. Panic attacks, panic disorder. You guys are familiar with these things. I love this picture. I don't know why.
Now explain.
I don't know why it's there. Why is that?
Is that G-Plan?
No, this is Pan. You know,
Baby?
the baby?
Here?
The
Who's
one
the
from
angel
Brady,
baby?
the fair
The
skinned lady
whitest
kinda looks
one?
like the older.
This-
Why is she so pale?
She just saw Pan.
Because she's panicked, she's being raped.
What's
The word,
She-
what's, oh my Lord.
Oh, yeah, but still.
So the word panic actually comes from Pan, the god who apparently used to take naps, and if you accidentally, no seriously, if you accidentally woke him up while you were walking in the woods, he would jump up and start screaming at you. And apparently it was such a blood-curdling scream that you could die from it.
Put you in a panic.
It puts you
Are you
in
saying
a panic.
pan or pain?
So,
So why do you pan then?
you would have to ask Mr. Barry, because I have no idea.
Why is there a winged creature?
It's a baby.
That I don't understand. I don't understand this whole situation. I don't know,
Google it.
who are these, I mean, like what is going on
What's he
here?
doing to her?
That there's like a gaggle of naked people in the woods.
I'm worried for well.
And then there's like so many little kids here. I mean, and what's the look on that kid's face?
He got woke up
God.
with the strange demon. He was also napping.
It's a demon.
And then Pan's coming out here. He's the only guy that looks happy.
That's Pan?
This is Pan.
Why is he
Is
naked?
it Pan? They
He
were
has
all
goat
naked.
legs. And
That's not an explanation.
he has horns.
Still wear pants.
Goats
have
don't
goat
wear
legs,
pants.
you don't
That
wear
is the
pants.
explanation,
Pan.
Kyle.
What's that called?
I disagree.
That other lady is awfully
Thank you.
white too.
What is a
Centaur.
pale, why are the women pale?
I think,
Yeah,
my
I
guess
think
is
it
this
was
is a female as well.
You kept him
She's a
inside.
demon. If ghosts did wear pants, like, you know the dog question, how do you think they should wear pants? Like, you would wear them on all four legs or just on the back?
I think that's it. She said. Go
He's standing up.
He's standing up, so this guy would wear pants just on the
I'm
bottom.
just saying in general, I think that's.
But-
Pants cover the butthole, so I think they go that way.
Yeah, that's how I always
The
see
point
it,
of
with a
pants
little
is to cover
tail.
your asshole.
Right.
So.
But some people.
I don't think that's the only part you're trying to cover, but that is one of them. So I don't know why, I don't know what's going on in this picture, but that's Pan. We talked about agoraphobia.
Have you ever seen the drawing?
I don't know why you need this list of things. These are the things that people with agoraphobia avoid. And I'm trying to think, like, how many of you have agoraphobia? Because, like, how many of you avoid shopping malls, buses, trains, subways, wide streets, tunnels?
Specifically, Pine Street, staying at home
Never.
alone.
I avoid tunnels.
There you go.
Go there.
There is some high concordance rate between monozygotic twins with panic disorders. So we're thinking about some genetic issues here. That's also sort of hard to separate out the environmental issues, but they would do this with twin studies, which unfortunately we don't get as many of. I guess unfortunately, I don't know. Unfortunately for the scientific community, but I guess fortunately for the twins themselves, we don't get a lot of twin studies anymore because they're not going around splitting twins up. Because apparently they think twins do better. I don't understand how this works. Because if you get two and you just like shoot out of the uterus, you have no idea that there's another person that came out with you.
Yeah.
That's what I think, right? Like how in the world would you know? You don't.
Yeah.
People say a lot of things. People say they've been abducted by aliens. I don't know. So that's something to think about. Phobias, we could talk about phobias. A lot of folks are, I mean, you guys know the common ones, right?
Yes.
Why did
Finally
you
got
choose
into this picture.
This guy is only afraid of corgis.
I mean, you can see why. You're like, look how cute. Those aren't cute.
It's not chunky.
No.
It's just got a chunky butt.
Mm-mm. Their legs are they like can't walk through certain areas
They can
because
walk
they'll
everywhere.
scratch their bellies. Like that's just not right.
Don't you eat that?
I didn't design the corgi. I apologize.
Well, wiener dogs are the same way. I have this little wiener dog in my neighborhood, and he can't even walk through the grass comfortably because his fat little belly's just like hanging along.
Give him some stilts.
Just makes me sad.
Here are a list of fun phobias. There's acrophobia. Those are people who are afraid of acrobats. That's what I like. Astrophobia, these are people who are afraid of the stars. There are people who are afraid of Santa Claus, claustrophobia. People hate Christmas.
You are laughing way too hard.
I like that one a lot.
He did, right? Why did he like that one so much? I don't know. So some of these are more common than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is-
Xenophobia.
Xenophobia.
It's pretty common right
That one
now.
gets 3 stars. If it's an A, it's people who are afraid of Lucy Wallace. That was a joke. That was a good joke.
That's good.
You guys are too young for that. I tried watching this show called Women Warriors. Did you ever see that show? She hosted this show. It was on Netflix. I was like, well, I'm going to watch that. It was awful. I watched like half an episode. I was like, take that off my list.
Xeno wasn't the best show either.
It was not. And I've abandoned Kevin Sorbo for a variety of reasons. So I can't even watch Hercules anymore. Right, Jason? Did you used to watch that show? There you go. Hierophobia. Some people are afraid of fire. I feel like that should be like all of us. Like most people should be like, have a healthy fear of fire, right? I guess some people are really, whatever.
How do you say the
Hematophobia?
Hematophobia. I got that.
Yeah, it's like hemoglobin, heat is blood. What'd you think it was?
I saw it.
I couldn't say it right. Like tomato.
Coming out, you're fine with other people.
So there you go. You guys love phobias, right? And apparently, for whatever reason, they did a whole slide here on, in Chinese culture, people are afraid of cold and being cold and loss of body heat. Yeah. So there you go. We could think about behavioral sensitization. I don't think we need to, but desensitization. You know how to do this, right? Somebody's afraid of clowns. You just have a clown jump out from behind a bush. That'll cure them. Does that work?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Just tie them down first, right? That's when constraint will work, because you don't want someone having a violent reaction because you jump in a clown costume.
I'm fine with humans constrained. That doesn't bother me.
Okay. So you're okay with tying up people?
Yeah.
Just not mice?
Yeah.
It says a lot about you. You like the type stuff.
Oh, hey, what about virtual reality? Any of you guys worked with virtual reality to get people over their fears? That sounds exciting though, doesn't it?
It sounds like something we can't afford around here.
Yeah, no, it clearly is, but I think,
It's a cool concept.
it is. There are a number
Like planes, like being fearful.
because it is very expensive to flood someone with a plane,
Because I had
right?
that fancy other computer.
I did that.
You did?
I did that to my friend Josh.
Oh.
He wouldn't go up like multiple flights of stairs, and I was like, let's get on a plane. So we flew to Europe.
That's a long flight. It was mean.
Yeah, so it was long enough that he was desensitized.
Planning ahead there, that was great, Dustin. There actually are some sports teams that use virtual reality for their players, right? To kind of reduce their stress. I've read about some basketball teams doing this, and some of the players, like, that's the scariest thing I've ever been through. Because some of the scenarios are quite frightening and realistic, right? Apparently some of them were, some of the scenarios they'll have you like walk across like a narrow plank or something, and you think there's like, you're gonna fall off and die. And some of the players would like get down and like hug the ground and try to like scoot across the floor because they were afraid they were gonna fall. And that's how realistic this virtual reality can be. So I think it actually has some real utility in a clinical setting. If you would have the funding for it, I think it could be effective. And one of the reasons for this is because you don't even have to experience, I think this is fascinating too, you don't even really have to experience the event that made you afraid of something, right? If you see someone attacked by a dog, you'll be afraid of dogs. Even if you weren't attacked by a dog yourself, right? That's a fairly common thing. That's why a lot of people are afraid of dogs. Because they see other people get attacked by dogs, not because they were attacked by a dog. So there you go. Surprised people didn't jump out with their weird phobia stories. Glad they did.
Don't have any weird phobias. Mine are all
That's what everybody says. Who has a weird phobia. Perfectly normal for me to be afraid of paper clips.
Like blood, yeah, that's normal. That's not fun.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between like an
Hospitals,
appropriate
bridges,
level.
elevators.
Planes.
Hospitals? I hate hospitals. Ugh.
Hospitals, bridges.
What about social anxiety disorder? Anybody aware of social anxiety
Oh my
disorder?
God. Oh.
Some people have that.
They all have
Yeah, right, Jason? I mean, you see a lot of folks with social anxiety disorder?
Mhm.
Yeah. Fear that sweating, trembling, or having a shaky voice may cause you embarrassment. That's going to happen. I don't know. After a certain point, I guess you just go like, ah, whatever, right? I mean, that's what most people do. I don't know. I'm one of these, like, this doesn't make sense to me. Being anxious, anticipating a feared activity, it's just a waste of time, right, guys? Like, I mean, like, if it's gonna be something that scares me or causes me anxiety, I'll just wait and deal with it then. I'm not gonna be anxious about my anxiety. It's just twice the work. But unfortunately, there are people who are anxious about their anxiety, right? And that's, I mean, not everybody is just sort of like me and just like, I don't really care.
They probably wouldn't have social anxiety.
Yeah, they probably would. Yeah, I don't know. Intense fear of talking to strangers. There you go. Concern that you'll offend someone.
They do everything you say though.
Yes.
Because they're afraid to offend you.
Yes.
That's what I needed to do. Where do you guys have these support groups? Well, there you go. Here's what I thought was interesting, because I really didn't know like whatever about anxiety disorders. A lot of folks get these when they're very young, right? I mean, we're talking about like 11 years old, right? Like half of people who have anxiety disorders, they're in the 5th grade, right? And they have these anxiety. I think that's sad, right? I mean, it's sad when it's like an adult and somebody's like 40 and they're all of a sudden like, oh man, I've got an anxiety disorder. But when you're like 10,
Makes sense though if you think about brain development.
it makes perfect sense if you think about brain development, right, Corey? Because what don't these kids have?
Frontal lobes.
Nothing. They got nothing in the front, right? And it's all amygdala going, I'm going to be afraid of everything. And if you think about, like, you know, when you were kids, I mean, there may have been some things that you were afraid of, right? And I think, it's obviously not social anxiety disorder, but definitely like those middle school, high school years, a lot of folks are, right, Olivia? A lot of folks are really afraid of, am I wearing the right pants? Am I wearing my pants the right way? Right?
Something like that, yeah.
Right? I mean, like all kinds of stuff, right? There's all kinds of things you're afraid of. Constantly afraid of these things. So, there's a lot of stuff you can do. Definitely that frontal lobe coming online, Corey, is helpful, right? So that's a big boost to you when you get a little older. Plus you get that extra social skills training, right? That you just pick up naturally as you're going through life. Some people do. So there you go. Fun stuff, right? Again, increased activity in the amygdala, not a big deal. PTSD, we've already talked a good bit about PTSD, right? You guys know some basics there. You did not know about the fun stuff about Tetris, which I think was exciting. That was in PLOS 1, for those of you that follow journals. PLOS 1's a decent journal, right? You don't know PLOS 1?
Okay.
It's a-
Just suck.
Judged.
It's a good journal. It really is a pretty good journal. Another, problem is, with these anxiety disorders, especially PTSD, increase in attempts of suicide. Lots of other problems. Substance abuse is a big issue, right? So somebody comes in and they've got PTSD and they're an alcoholic. Where do you start, right? I don't know. I mean, it wasn't an entirely rhetorical question. Might have some idea about where to start. Might try both things at once. You got to get them somewhere, right? I mean, because they might be, you don't just go like, let's get you off the alcohol. And then the reason I started drinking was because of the anxiety. I don't know. Some people are more susceptible than others. Again, there's a genetic link, not a big deal there. again, there is a little bit of an increase in women who have PTSD over men. You've got to watch those estrogen levels. We talked about cortisol levels already. We talked about parents who have kids, they're going to be more likely to have PTSD. I think this was actually kind of interesting. This was looking at Holocaust survivors. If anybody's going to develop PTSD, it's going to be somebody who survived the Holocaust, right? I mean, because that was a bad deal for those of you that don't recall your history very well. Sort of a timely slide too, right? Because I think a lot of people have sort of forgotten some of these important things. And so Destiny, we're going to remind them, because the same people who are going to, Nicole, get your don't rape message are also going to get this message. Right?
We gotta publish it.
I know, we got such a wide audience. You know, the 45 subscribers I have to my channel.
Yeah.
You have like subscribers, like
Yes.
not where they just put it
They're
in
gonna learn today.
the search bar.
Subscribers.
Stop raping.
Wow.
And don't
Stop
Holocaust.
raping.
Yeah.
Don't Holocaust
No.
people. It's mean.
Good luck with that.
So what's interesting is that folks who had PTSD and who were children of Holocaust survivors, and their parents had PTSD, they actually had, again, we were talking about those lower blood cortisol levels, right? And we're talking about how that's bad because you're not able to have that appropriate response, right? You need cortisol to deal with stress and anxiety, right? If you're already down here, I mean, at half, you got to get up, you got to double your cortisol level just to get to normal. And then you got to go above that. I mean, it's just, right? I mean, that's a tough road. So there you go. I don't know if anybody found that interesting. Because that's kind of the opposite of what you would think, right? You would think folks with PTSD would have elevated cortisol levels because they're always stressed, you would think, right? I mean, that's sort of the opposite of that. I don't really want to talk a whole lot about OCD because, I mean, I think it's an odd fit here, but you guys know about OCD, right?
Mm-hmm.
People have these obsessions and then they do some behavior to act upon it. That's the compulsion, right? Okay. So we can sort of skip through this. What about drugs? We already talked about some of the drugs. Things that are CNS depressants, barbiturates will definitely take care of your anxiety. Would typically recommend those. Benzodiazepines, alcohol, all things that will definitely take care of your anxiety, right? Not something we should really try. Here are just some other drugs, some of the effects of those drugs. They do these anti-conflict tests, right? If rats are relaxed, they're not going to fight. So you can give these rats drugs. Stop. Again, we have to worry about those side effects. Jason, we talked about some of those, right, before. All the way down there to coma and death, right? So this is alertness, you're up here, and you want to be in this range, right? You don't really want to get people typically to sedation, although in a short-term situation, just you might, right? Especially in your line of work at the moment, right? There might be times where sedation seems like a good idea, but typically that's not where you want to go. Again, we talked about all of these are GABA, increased GABA, they have binding sites on there, so that's pretty good. I don't know, this is interesting, just showing you changes in membrane potential, right? So you see a reduction in membrane potential when diazepam is added to GABA, right? So that's a benzodiazepine, so you're going to see that sort of extra dip. So you get a little bonus there, which is kind of cool. I think this is actually a better graph for you, for those of you who aren't really excited about membrane potentials. But this is basically showing you how, current conductance. So if you just have GABA, you're getting a lot of chloride in there, right? So 100%, that's pretty awesome. If you add benzodiazepines to that GABA, you can sort of double the amount of chloride that's coming in, right? That's a big effect. But if you add an antagonist to the benzodiazepine, so you're giving them a benzodiazepine and then something to counteract the benzodiazepine, it just brings you right back to where you were with just the GABA. This was a test. This isn't something, this is an experiment, Destiny. This is not like a clinical.
Just trying to figure out why you would do that. But
To figure it out.
yeah.
There was no rats though.
It was in a rat that was in a cone and couldn't move for 10 days. But then if you take GABA and you give them a benzodiazepine, and then you give them a GABA antagonist, you have a massive reduction. So this is showing you that the benzodiazepines alone cannot activate that chloride channel, right? You have to have GABA present to get that activation. So that's kind of cool. And here you go. These are just a bunch of drugs. You don't have to really worry about that slide too much. Barbiturates, again, folks aren't going to typically take barbiturates. They're not that great. They do have some different varieties depending on how lipid soluble they are, so how quickly they work. Here are your barbiturates. I doubt most of you have heard of these. Some of them are used for anesthesia, right, or some prolonged sedation. So there you go. Pentobarbital is used as a euthanasia drug in some settings. So if you have to take your dog or cat or parakeets, they might not. They might gas them. I don't know. I'm just trying to think about if it would be easy, right? Than giving a bird an injection. It's really hard. You could, but you know that's typically what you get there. Barbiturates, you're going to have a lot of side effects. You know, not going to get the REM sleep you deserve. Cause serious intoxication, coma.
Sweet.
Your liver problems there. You know that's a problem. The problem with barbiturates too is you get cross tolerance to other drugs. Right, it's not going to work as well, which becomes a problem when you're trying to, you know, if you've got a patient or a client who's on one drug and they try to switch to a different drug, that drug may or may not be that effective if they're in the same class, right? So if you're just swapping around SSRIs or something, that might not really help. You may need to switch to a different class of drug to get that going. You guys know about tolerance. We've talked about this. You have to increase the effective dose. And that puts you closer to the have a coma dose. So yeah, that's a bad story, right? So use drugs sparingly if you develop tolerance to them. Benzodiazepines, these, you know, I mean, they're a little safer than barbiturates. They're a little better. They still cause a lot of problems of this. Some of them can work quite rapidly. Here's the basic structure. You can see they're all very similar, right? They all kind of have that same ring structure, whether it's Valium or something else. A lot of them are short-acting, right? That's because they become inactive in just one step, right? So you give folks lorazepam, and they can just pretty quickly metabolize that into something that's not effective anymore. So these guys are down here at the short-acting benzodiazepines. The longer-acting up here, you know, again, Valium being sort of the stereotypical version. It takes a little longer to get it to that inactive metabolite and for you to excrete that. Not a big deal. There are date rape drugs, right? So you guys know about those. Really bad when they're combined with alcohol, so that's why it's always best to take your own cup with a screw-on lid to the bar. You guys don't do that, do you? And you probably don't even watch your glasses when you're moving around. You just leave them there.
Yeah, we do. We're adults.
You watch
Take
it.
it to the bathroom with you.
Yeah.
To the bathroom.
I'm watching
If you put it down, you're done.
Yeah, you're done though. Do you know now though they're slipping people ecstasy so she looks like she's having a good time? That's a thing.
There you go.
Because if someone's roofied, we're all
You can
gonna
tell.
notice and be
Yeah.
like, hey, put her down. But
Yeah.
if she's like, yeah, or he, sorry, don't mean to be sexist. Usually.
The web box was a little sexist.
Really?
They said, yeah, they said male to female.
Well, I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah, I added in some statistics about the
Excellent.
likelihood of
I'll probably
college
read those.
males.
it's not pure.
It's 5 times higher than a male that's not in college.
Really? Wow. There you go.
Predators.
We already talked about old people, right? Don't give old people drugs. Especially don't
This is
give
gonna
them.
be really fun to listen
You know something else old people do a lot of? They eat grapefruits. And that's a problem.
Which interferes with everything.
It does. It
Does it
does.
really? Yeah, they
I
put it
was-
on so many pill bottles you can't have.
Birth control people.
What? I can't eat grapefruit?
No.
I mean, if
Or
it's,
go
I
in
mean,
the
I
sun.
don't.
if it's
sunlight
hormonal,
too.
like, I mean, if you go with some non-hormonal
Yeah.
approaches to birth control, you can still
I
do
know
that.
That was
I know what
grapefruit,
birth
yeah,
control
what
is.
is that?
Grapefruit interferes with some of the enzymes that break down basically every drug you'll ever take.
Shit.
Yeah. What it does in some drugs is it'll give you like a double dose. So when these people, I know, right? So they'll take their blood pressure medication, right?
Oh God, I gotta call Tink.
And then you get like 2. So there you
What
go.
about grapefruit? Man, ew. I don't know, it just says natural flavors.
Grapefruit wine.
It says natural.
What about grapefruit LaCroix?
Now you're really
real
wanna
grapefruit or not.
Benzodiazepines, you can take these for other things. You might see people on a benzodiazepine as an anticonvulsant. So there's that. Not a big deal. Again, we talked about Valium. Benzodiazepines actually, I mean, they're kind of interesting because they don't really get your liver enzymes rolling as much, and so you're not going to have that enzymatic tolerance, right? So the tolerance mechanisms are going to be a little different. And they're, you know, I mean, some people will abuse benzodiazepines. They're not as addictive as like barbiturates, so they're slightly better choice in that regard. But if you can start targeting things like the GABA-A receptor, right, selectively, that's pretty awesome. So there are, you know, drugs that they're working on that can do that. Not a big deal. I've already talked about. Those are the hormones we were talking about earlier that you can actually give it to mice who have sort of a analog of PTSD, and it seems to reduce their behaviors, which is kind of interesting. You're gonna get too excited about that. There's Buspar, right? This is how you spell it, in case you're curious. You know, it's a second generation anxiolytic. It does some effects. It's got some advantages. It'll actually work on the depression that comes with anxiety, so you get a 2-for-1 there, so that's pretty awesome. You don't typically get the sedation or confusion or other sort of cognitive issues, right? And it doesn't seem to interfere with other, you know, CNS depressants or alcohol, which is pretty good as well. So there aren't a lot of folks like, you know, trying to use it recreationally. And then so far nobody's really seen a withdrawal period, so that's kind of nice too. So if somebody has to come off of it. The problem is, it takes a long time to work, right? In the way, you know, benzodiazepines are pretty fast acting, right? You take one of those, it's done. Buspirone, it takes such a long time. You have to take it a couple times a day. So if you're just like dealing with an immediate situation, right? Like your wife left you or something, it's not going to be helpful, right? You're going to have to take something else. I'm assuming you see clients that have that happen, right? Right?
Yeah.
They usually just cheat, they don't cheat. In my experience.
It's okay. Well, there we go.
I think that's a worse problem, because then you're like, oh, should I be with this person or not? And then they continue to cheat on them. Yeah, it's kind of sad.
Well, I mean, I don't know. No comments there. Tricyclics, there you go. Next week we'll talk about something else.